Hey guys, what's going on? It's Louie here and welcome to my ultimate guide on table tennis ratings. I am going to split this video into two parts. Part 1 is going to simply explain the skill level that corresponds to each rating range, and part 2 is going to try and explain the nuance around trying to figure out what percentile of the player base a certain rating would put you in, which is a lot more difficult than you may think. As usual, timestamps are in the description, and I hope you enjoy the video. Before we get started, I want to highlight the difference between the American Elo system, also known as USATT ratings, and TTR, which is a similar but different Elo system used in several other countries like Germany. TTR is much less standardized, where even in two different cities within the same country, the ratings could indicate different levels. With that said, there is roughly a 200 to 500 point difference between USATT ratings and TTR. The average difference is around 300 points or so, but again this can vary a lot depending on region, so take it with a grain of salt. But to illustrate, a 2400 TTR would be approximately 2700 in the USATT system. So if you need to convert between TTR and USATT or vice versa, hopefully that gives you a rough idea. For the purposes of this video, I will be explaining everything in terms of USATT ratings. So, the rating system here goes from technically 0 up to around 2900 or 3000. The first thing I want to mention is that the higher your rating gets, the harder it is to climb. That is to say, you start to run into diminishing returns. For example, you can climb from 800 to 1200 extremely quickly, but it would take much longer to climb from, let's say, 1800 to 2200. Something to note is that the rating system used here is also very similar, although not identical to the chess Elo system. So for example, while there are some differences, the skill level of someone who's 1200 in chess is similar to the skill level of a 1200 rated table tennis player. So starting from the bottom, it is very unlikely, even for a complete beginner, to have a playing level between 0 and 300. The only way realistically that you could get your rating to this range is if a bunch of unrated players had a tournament with one person happening to lose to everyone. But really, total beginners are going to range from about 500, assuming they can hold a paddle and hit the ball on the table, up to around 800. These are players that either have no coaching whatsoever, or are still learning the fundamentals of the sport, including grip, basic footwork, driving, pushing, and blocking. This Elo range is also the level of the vast majority of casual players. Even players like your local office champion, or the dude that has a table in their basement so they seem really good, are all still for the most part going to be in this Elo range. But you still gotta watch out, because these players know tons of tricks and can still be pretty talented, play good shots, and stomp people who have never played before. Between 800 and 1200 are what I'd like to say are your advanced beginners. If they've had coaching, this is where they're starting to master the fundamentals. They'll be able to consistently rally the ball, generate some of their own spin, and some of these players may also be learning advanced shots like loops. A player with absolutely no coaching who is exceptionally talented or athletic could also get into this Elo range. Players in this range will absolutely crush all your basement and garage champions who have never played at a club before. From the perspective of an average person, these players look really good. 1200 to 1500 are going to be your intermediate level players. If you've trained to get to this point, you're starting to get very good and get into more of the nuances of the sport, like placement, shot selection, variation, and so on. I have had the pleasure of going up against several full-time professional athletes from other sports, including starting players from the Washington Commanders, and from experience, I would say 1500, maybe 1600 or a little bit higher, is about the cap of how good you can get with no formal coaching, training, or club play whatsoever, but you have to be insanely talented or athletic to do this. For the most part, other than getting into more of the nuances, intermediates work on a lot of the same things that advanced beginners are working on, but do everything just a little bit better, especially the level of spin they're able to generate. 1500 to 1800 is an upper intermediate level, with 1800 being considered advanced. If you've watched any of my match reviews, a lot of the people I coach are around this level, so you can look at the clips I have on screen now to have a general idea of what these players look like. Again, they do a lot of what the previous level does, but with much deeper knowledge and understanding of the nuances, and much better shot quality, footwork, placement, and so on. At 1800, an average onlooker would think that you're a professional player. At this point, players also start to develop their own playing style and develop what I like to call their own bread and butter shots and combinations. At this point, you also may start learning the hardest shots of table tennis, like the counter loop, flips, short touches, and so on. 1800 to 2000 is starting to get extremely advanced. 1800 to 2000 is also where you really start to see major diminishing returns in terms of rating jumps. In other words, climbing the ratings from here becomes insanely difficult. To illustrate, if you trained properly every single day, basically full time, and were seriously committed to improving, you could go from a complete beginner level to 1800 in well under a year. However, to get from 1800 to 2000 might take the same amount of time as that first jump, despite it only being 200 more points. At this level, players are ripping the ball full speed, but they normally don't have a complete game yet. What I mean is that they normally still have a couple holes in their game, although you'd have to be a very, very good player to exploit this. But again, like before, they do a lot of the same as the level below, but with better quality, a deeper understanding of tactics, and so on. From 2000 to 2200, something else worth starting to talk about is physical training. Obviously, you need to have a fair amount of movement at all levels, but you can definitely get to between 1800 and 2000, maybe even a little higher if you're exceptionally talented, without a huge physical component to your game. However, from 2000 and up, table tennis transforms into one of the most physically demanding sports on the planet. It's no longer just about technical skills or strategy, even though those are both still insanely important, but your body also becomes a weapon, and how well you train it can determine whether you win or lose. Explosiveness, strength, insane cardiovascular endurance, and agility are all absolutely necessary. As the ratings get higher and higher from here, the physical aspect becomes more and more important. On top of that, these players start to have a pretty complete game, with any holes to exploit becoming harder and harder to find. There are many coaches around this level, and normally the top players at small to mid-sized clubs will be around this level as well. Over 2000, the specifics of what you need to work on to continue improving vary so much player by player that there's no sort of generalized description any coach could give. Over 2200 is a semi-professional level. At this level, you're good enough to consistently win some money playing in local leagues and tournaments. This is also good enough to earn some decent money playing in the pro leagues, although definitely not in the top divisions, and not enough money to make a full living, hence why it is semi-professional, as players in this range will almost certainly have another full-time job. I'd also say this is the level where realistically you're good enough to where you could try to make a living as a full-time coach if that's what you wanted to do. You'll have a lot of up-and-coming players, junior national team members, and so on that are in the 2200 range or higher, and there's also a lot of retired full-time professional players who can still easily maintain a playing standard over 2200, many even higher without much practice. Beyond this point, there are no tricks to improving other than practicing and conditioning your body every single day until you get better. Once you're over 23 or 2400, to actually maintain that level requires regular practice, and that means the second you stop playing, you're going to see your standard fall. 24 to 2500 and above is a true full-time professional level, although not necessarily the best in the world. As a side note, most full-time pros stop playing in their late 30s to early 40s, as at the professional level, the sport just becomes too demanding to keep up with the younger players. So with that said, let's talk about your best players in the world. These are the players that are all over 2600, and at this point the rating system kind of breaks down because there are so few players over 2600. Because of that, beyond a 2600 level or so, it makes more sense to talk about ranking than it does rating. So for example, instead of saying he's 2710, say he's top 50, top 20, top 5, and if you take the top 20 players in the world, they're probably over 2900 in terms of what their rating would be. So that about sums up the first part of my guide on rating, and now I want to move to part 2, which is basically trying to figure out what percentile a certain rating puts you in. Alright, on to part 2. Let's dive into this and try to figure out what percentile a specific rating places you in. In other words, exactly how good are you when you're at X rating. This might seem like a very simple calculation, but it's far more complex than it appears because your percentile depends entirely on the reference group you're comparing against. Are you comparing yourself to all table tennis players, club players, or active tournament players. The answer changes dramatically depending on the group. Let's take someone ranked 100 in the country. There are 10,794 active tournament players with a rating higher than 0. So you might say, oh, we can do some simple math, and that means the person ranked 100 is roughly in the top 1% of the player base. However, being ranked 100 does not put you in the top 1% of the player base. It's actually much stronger than we give it credit for, and there's a couple reasons for this. Firstly, USATT tournament data is extremely skewed because it includes many players who are no longer actively competing or not located in the country. For example, players who haven't played since 2018 are listed as active, and their ratings are included on all the lists, which inflates the number of tournament participants and makes the rankings seem less impressive than they actually are. For example, if you're ranked 100, but only 60 people above you have played a tournament in 2024, you're really top 60, not top 100. Second, tournaments are disproportionately played by stronger players. Beginners or casual players are far less likely to enter tournaments, meaning the average skill level of a tournament player is much higher than the skill level of an average table tennis player. On top of that, the number of tournament players or even club players is many orders of magnitude lower than the total player base. Think about how many people you know, whether it be friends, family, co-workers, and so on, that have played table tennis before but haven't played a tournament. Most estimates say about 19 million Americans play table tennis, or roughly 1 in 18. And so being top 100 out of 19 million Americans is more like the top 0.0005% of the player base. As an analogy, in a game like chess, or even an esport like Valorant, or literally anything else, you'd consider all players, even those that just play online or for fun, but not in official sanctioned tournaments, part of the player base. So why should it be any different for table tennis? As another example, take a 1400. 1400 may be considered average, quote unquote, compared to other people that put a ton of time into the sport, but it's way above average compared to your typical player. But because once you start to play a lot, you surround yourself with others that also play a lot, you forget how relatively good you are compared to, let's say, local basement warriors or office champions. In other words, a 1400 is going to destroy anyone that hasn't put much serious time into the sport. The vast majority of the 19 million or so table tennis players don't play super seriously, which means those that do start to put some time and effort into it are immediately better than the vast majority, even at a 13 to 1400 rating. For what it's worth, this fact is true in just about any activity that is easy to learn and start, but extremely hard to master with a high skill ceiling. Just look at chess, where again this trend is the same. And by 1800 to 2000, you're easily well into the top 1%, just because of how many players there are that won't put this level of effort in. I'm going to attempt to estimate roughly where ratings would align compared to the total player base. This is a completely educated guess on my part, but I think I'll be fairly accurate since I have quite a lot of experience playing in clubs. I am not going to be making any list of the distribution of tournament players since the data from USATT is so bad, and I would have to manually take out every player that hasn't played a tournament in 2024. However, if someone has a bunch of time to kill and wants to do this, be my guest and I'll pin your comment. I am sort of using the chess.com rapid rating distribution as a point of reference. I'm not copying it exactly because I kind of have a general idea myself of the table tennis player base, but I like using this because it's a very similar sample size of 15 million players, again with the vast majority being casual, non-tournament players, and while not identical, uses quite a similar Elo system. But anyway, I'm being very conservative here to ensure that I'm as accurate as possible, but I would say under 800 to 1,000 is going to be the bottom 50% of the player base. 1,000 to 1,200 puts you at least in the top 40 to 50% of the player base. 1,200 to 1,500 puts you in the top 10 to 20%, probably even stronger. And by 1,800 to 2,000, you're easily in the top 1% of the player base. When you get to 21 or 2,200, you're going to be one of the top players in your state, as there's only a couple hundred active players in the US above this level, and at this level, you'd be the #1 player at most clubs in the country, barring hotspots where tons of elite players are located, but even at hotspots, you'd be considered a very strong player. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I hope this was helpful and that you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave it a big thumbs up and drop a comment for the algorithm. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're all doing well, and I will have a match review out soon. Thank you again, and until next time.